All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a seriously intense, honestly, almost combative philosophy on dopamine and self-actualization. Our source text really doesn't pull any punches here, so we're going to break down its core arguments, step by step, to understand exactly what the author means when they talk about shattering the illusion of cheap dopamine.
So, let's start with the incredibly visceral reality described right at the beginning of the text. The author paints this modern picture that is, frankly, a little too familiar for most of us. Picture this. You wake up, you doom scroll on your phone for hours, maybe eat some junk food, feel completely sluggish, and then bam, you get hit with this heavy, crushing guilt. The source asks us to imagine a blaring fire alarm just going off in our minds. But instead of, putting out the actual fire, we just throw a thick blanket of pleasure over the alarm to muffle the sound. That alarm, according to the text, is your inner pain desperately trying to tell you that you are on the wrong path.
Now, to really understand why that guilt hits so hard, we have to look at how this source completely redefines the concept of addiction for the modern age. The text argues that society falsely limits the word addict strictly to people who abuse things like alcohol or illicit drugs. But the author asserts something much broader. Anything you use to escape reality and suppress your internal pain is an addiction. Under this new definition, things like excessive screen time, chasing digital validation on dating apps, or binge-eating junk food, they all function the exact same psychological way as chemical narcotics.
And this dynamic, it creates an absolute trap. The author outlines this vicious four-step cycle that dictates so many people's lives. It starts with step 1. You feel a baseline of inner pain or emptiness. Then, your brain falsely tells you that you need pleasure to fix it, which leads to step 2, seeking out a quick, temporary hit of cheap dopamine. Next comes step 3, which is the inevitable crash when that high fades away. And that leaves us right at step 4, feeling a pain that is actually far worse than what we started with, all because the root cause was entirely ignored.
The whole core of this argument is summed up perfectly in this one stark quote from the text. You didn't actually eliminate the pain, you just threw a cheap blanket of pleasure over it. The source is emphasizing that chasing cheap dopamine doesn't actually cure your misery. It literally just masks the psychological distress that's actively trying to alert you to a massive problem. Because when that dopamine fog finally clears, that underlying bleeding wound, yeah, it's still right there waiting for you.
So, why is this numbing effect so incredibly destructive to your long-term potential? Well, to explain this, the author introduces a really vivid metaphor, imagining the human mind as a pressure cooker. Here's how the mechanics of that pressure cooker actually work according to the text. Think of your inner pain, that frustration you feel with living an average or unfulfilling life, as the rising heat and pressure inside the cooker. Meanwhile, cheap dopamine acts as the release valve. Every single time you doom scroll or seek out instant gratification, you are hitting that release valve. You blow off the steam, and because you are constantly releasing that pressure, the food inside never actually cooks. You literally prevent yourself from ever harnessing the raw, pressurized energy that is fundamentally required to make a massive change in your life.
So what's the fix here? Well, the text advocates for a complete and ruthless purge of all these cheap dopamine sources. It demands you cut out the mindless video games, the doom scrolling, pornography, the endless chase for digital validation, and the binge eating. The logic is pretty straightforward. By sealing off that release valve, you force yourself to actually sit with and feel the discomfort.
Now, the text totally acknowledges that doing this is brutally difficult. It brings in the concept of jumping into the ice water. The argument here is that every time a natural fire of motivation finally begins to burn inside your belly, giving into those digital addictions is the exact equivalent of jumping straight into a freezing pool. You instantly extinguish the very fire that could have actually propelled you forward.
But listen, if you actually commit to cutting off that dopamine flow, the source warns you are going to go through some intense withdrawal. It'll feel basically akin to a physical dependency. You'll feel restless, incredibly anxious, and deeply uncomfortable. But the text makes a massive promise here. If you leave it alone, this very agony will transform into a powerful inferno of motivation. As the quote puts it, that withdrawal will give you the raw, aggressive power to completely rewrite your destiny.
Which brings us to a really stark, high-stakes metaphor. The author uses it to describe the ultimate choice you've got to make regarding all this pain. It's called the burning room analogy, and it is entirely designed to force a massive perspective shift on how we view comfort versus survival. Okay. Imagine you are trapped in a burning room. Right in the middle of the floor sits a bottle of heavy whiskey. The author presents a brutal ultimatum here. Choice A is to chug the whiskey, pass out, and essentially die comfortably numb in your sleep.
Choice B is to smash the bottle, completely eliminating your escape route. Now you are forced to feel the blistering heat, which physically compels you to claw at the walls until you find the hidden exit. The text is fiercely advocating for a gladiator mentality, arguing that it is so much better to fight tooth and nail through the harsh heat of reality than to willingly numb yourself into destruction.
But hold on, because the source cautions that the solution isn't as simple as just working insanely hard for material goods. The text introduces the concept of hard-earned pleasures, like grinding relentlessly to buy a sports car or a massive mansion. The author argues that using wealth to try and cure what they call the gaping hole in your soul is literally just a more socially acceptable form of addiction. The high of a new car will eventually fade, for sure, and that underlying pain will still be sitting right there in the passenger seat next to you.
To map out exactly where people fall in this whole dynamic, the text categorizes modern men into 3 distinct archetypes. First, you have the drifters, who just chase cheap dopamine and live in a state of pretty pathetic misery. Second, you've got the hustlers, who realize cheap dopamine is bad, but they just replace it by grinding for money and luxury, falsely believing that wealth will somehow fill the internal void. And finally, the self-actualized. According to the text, this elite top 1% steps off the hamster wheel entirely. They recognize that neither cheap thrills nor expensive materialism can cure them, so they actually look inward to find the root cause of their suffering.
So how do you actually reach that top 1%? Well, the text doesn't frame this journey as some casual weekend self-improvement hobby. It calls it an absolute revolution for your survival. The author is calling for shattering those physical habits that keep you chained, breaking the mental paradigms causing your depression, and actively fighting against algorithmic brainwashing. It even compares this inner war to historic leaders, invoking the Founding Fathers freezing at Valley Forge. The point is that true freedom requires adopting a mindset that prefers extreme hardship over a life of submissive algorithmic slavery. And you know, just like any legendary superhero movie needs some absolute nightmare fuel for a villain, the author introduces your ultimate psychological enemy. They call this enemy the illusion, or the matrix. This is basically the dark personification of your own internal resistance and addiction. The illusion is characterized as that incredibly weak, primal voice inside your head. You know the one. Right as you start to actually gain some momentum in your life, this voice will whisper, "Take a break, man. Just hit the snooze button. Come on, open Instagram, just for 5 minutes." The text warns that this voice uses the comfort of synthetic realities to trick you, trying to drag you right back down into the basement of your potential, exactly when you're on the verge of breaking free. So how exactly do we defeat this villain? Well, the text argues you've got to look it right in the eye and recognize its cheap tricks for what they are: fear and comfort. You have to actively refuse to be a slave to these synthetic, pixelated realities. The source notes that you must even accept the very real possibility that your hard work might result in absolute failure, and simply not care. By standing your ground and refusing to trade your self-respect for fake, cheap pleasures, you systematically strip away the illusion's power over you. To really lock in this mindset, the source demands something pretty extreme, taking a metaphorical blood oath. This is framed as a deeply personal, uncompromising commitment, where you actively choose the suffering that forges you into a weapon, while completely rejecting the synthetic suffering that turns you into a compliant slave.
This whole philosophy culminates in this one incredibly powerful idea. Feeling pain does not mean I need to seek pleasure. Feeling pain means I need to seek freedom. The author's final emphatic warning here is that if you do stumble on this difficult path, and you probably will, you must not run back to the numbing agents. Let the shame burn you, cry if you have to, suffer if you must, but do absolutely everything in your power to avoid numbing that feeling.
Ultimately, the source leaves us with a really profound challenge to reflect upon. It's a direct call to action asking us to look critically at our own daily habits. Are you escaping the pain of mediocrity, or are you staying stuck in the past? The author challenges us to decide right here, right now, whether we will stay asleep in the illusion or embrace the heat of the fire and fight for reality. It's a heavy question for sure, and it's exactly where this text leaves us